Baldi Basics is probably one of the most popular indie horror games to come out in the past few years. It started as a fun Slender clone, and then it progressed into a lot more over time. However, ever since this game's blow up, it sort of fell into irrelevancy. Not really in a bad way, it's just that making a game that was meant to be a parody to other games doesn't really give it inherently that much life. But Baldi Basics is actually gearing up for what seems to be quite the incredible comeback this summer that I'm sure a lot of us have been waiting for a while now. And this comeback includes an entirely brand new game that has been in the works for the past couple of years. So I don't think that Baldi itself needs too much of an introduction. It is a basic game that originally is meant to look like an average everyday low budget math game. However, when the questions would slowly get unreasonably hard, the main antagonist Baldi would then chase the player down through the hallway while trying to collect all of the notebooks. The game is pretty scary in some senses, but for the most part it's a comedic take into the world of horror, and I actually think it's done pretty well. The game initially was developed as a game jam competition entry, which if you don't know what that is, it's basically just a speedrun competition but with game development. And after a second place finish, the game started to gain some traction, especially after YouTubers like Cub Scouts would feature it on the popular Series 3 random games. Anyway, this game, like other horror titles, grew its audience thanks to these YouTubers playing their game. Some other big YouTubers to play this game include Markiplier, Jacksepticeye, and like everyone, to be honest. This game had such a big reach, and it was something that a lot of people were interested in. But right out of the gate, there was somewhat of a problem. That of which being the game was so incredibly basic that its lifespan couldn't last very long since it was so short. So naturally, the developer Micah started to actually roll out all sorts of updates with the game. Some of the notable ones including Baldi Basics Birthday Bash, which made the entire game just 10 times weirder. And of course, most infamously, the secret ending of the game that required players of the game to basically drive themselves crazy by somehow getting every single question wrong during the session while also still beating it. But these updates weren't necessarily what Micah was really looking for in a full Baldi title. So instead of it just living on as this small little math game parody, he would actually move it over into a full expansive title called Baldi Basics Plus. This game was more or less the same concept, but things were expected to be a lot bigger. For example, most notably, there were tons of other game modes and even randomly generated maps. Thankfully, despite what may have been seen as a risky move, Micah ended up putting the game on Kickstarter, to which it would be fully funded. So people were really ready for this game. But so far, this was pretty much the last game that Micah would release up until this point, and fast forward to today, it's still in development, but it's also playable in early access. For at least a little bit, it was receiving regular updates, and while I'm sure a lot of you guys lost interest in the game at this point, it still was maintaining a small community of people who were still interested in playing the game no matter what. Update after update, it was getting closer and closer to actually finishing as a full game until, it vanished. On July 2nd of 2021, Baldi Basics Plus would release one final update, which made a few adjustments of things along with some bug fixes. But from this point forward, the game would go absolutely silent. No updates, no answers, no really anything. This honestly seemed like it could have been the end for Baldi because nothing was really being done with the game anymore. But despite this lack of updates, in my last video on this topic, I had mentioned that 2022 seemed like it would be a very important year for Baldi Basics. And based on what I'm about to show you, I actually may have been correct. So before talking about 2022 and everything, going back to last year on the 3-year anniversary of the original Baldi Basics, a video on Micah's channel would release that detailed talks of a brand new game in the works by the name of Baldi Basics Classic Remastered. This brand new Baldi experience was almost going to work as a Baldi Basics 1.5 release, being designed to be a perfect, more improved version of the original classic game that blew up initially, which is contrary from Baldi Basics Plus, where Micah is trying new things. This project was a surprise announcement for this anniversary, and with that being said, we knew Micah was going to take a while for the game to finally come out. And by a while, apparently that meant the rest of 2021. Because from this point forward, besides some tweets by Micah saying the classic version was being worked on, we didn't really hear much. There were a couple Steam pages released for the game, but they were also pretty bare, and I don't even think the footage put in the screenshots is actually from the remastered title. But moving aside from that, things began to seem a little depressingly minimal. Micah had expressed concerns previously that working on this long-awaited Baldi Basics Classic was potentially going to take time away from his main passion being Baldi Basics Plus, and that seemed to be the case honestly, as information was becoming harder and harder to come by as the days went on. But here in 2022, we are still sort of asking the same question of where in the world is Baldi Basics Plus Remastered? And if it still is being developed after over a year, when is it coming? Well, for once, I actually think we're on track to start answering these questions finally. The first huge piece of news that we got recently would actually be an official screenshot of the real Baldi Basics Classic Remastered game. Are you guys ready to see it? Well, here it is. Okay, yeah, it's definitely not the greatest picture we could have been sent, but I guess regardless, it's here, and we can at least tell a couple of things about this screenshot, most of which being some noticeable changes to the way the UI looks. The first thing we see is an updated stamina bar, which I guess is kind of cool, but the most interesting thing is this Baldi figure here in the bottom right. If you haven't played any of the updated versions of Baldi's Basics, this may seem a bit confusing to you, but in the newer versions of the game, there's a new mechanic on the screen for the player that every time we make a noise that alerts Baldi to our location, his little head would pop up to let us know that he knows where we're at. This is an important feature that made it a lot more obvious when Baldi was aware of where you were, so it seems pretty obvious that this would be brought over into this new edition. However, the thing that makes this one interesting is that the interface on this blurry screenshot looks noticeably different than Baldi's Basics Plus or any of the other versions. So with that being said, this is a clear visual that a lot of things are going to be changing in this remastered version. Also, by the way, what in the world is this big red blob in front of us? This user on Twitter recreated what they think the image reveals, and it does appear to be some sort of painting, but it's just too vague right now for us to know. Anyway, this was our first ever update for Baldi this year, but it wouldn't be the last, because the as mentioned Baldi's Basics Plus game that was sort of ghosted for the past year would once again start receiving updates literally as of a couple weeks ago. And by that, I don't mean just like one update with a bug fix or anything. I'm talking 3 separate back-to-back updates that included tons of different changes to the game, most of which involving small changes to the way that the game is run mechanically, giving new AI updates along with a bunch of new changes to the way that the characters work. Most of these updates were big on these attention to detail based mechanics, which is probably pretty cool if you are a Baldi's Basics Plus fan, but I imagine that most of you guys are here for this new Baldi's Basics Classic Remastered release that has been hyped up for the past year, so you may be asking how any of this relates to that new title that hasn't came out yet. Well, on the surface, it doesn't. However, to get some more information, we have to look back to when the Classic Remastered version was first announced. Micah told us that he was holding off on making this remastered version for a while, but the reason why he says he's willing to do it now is because he's planning on working on Baldi's Basics Plus and the Classic Remastered version all at the same time, so that way any UI changes or AI changes he makes to the remastered version can also be applied to his other versions. And honestly, I think that's exactly what is happening right now. I mean, it's nearly been a year ever since we've gotten a single Baldi's Basics Plus update, and do you really think it took Micah this long just to add a couple game changes to Baldi's Basics Plus? I don't think so. In fact, I think that the remastered version is getting really close to finishing, and right now Micah is currently transferring a lot of the improvements in the remastered version over to Baldi's Basics Plus. And the reason I believe this is because, I mean, they released 3 different updates in the matter of like a week, which realistically for me doesn't seem to be possible. That is unless all the updates had already been completed and just needed to be optimized for different versions. All of these new updates show us that Micah is finally starting to get a lot of stuff done. And the reason why I think Baldi's Basics went on this 1-year hiatus was because for most of 2021 and a little bit of 2022, the main focus was on the remastered version, and now that this game is what I believe to be finished, Micah is transferring all the improvements over to his other game. But if it's really finished, then why isn't it out yet? Well, I mean, this new remastered version is gonna be something super special. It most likely won't be the largest thing that we've ever seen from Micah. However, I assume the goal of remastering such a classic title is to give us a lot more nostalgia from the past. And so with that being said, a really special game probably needs a really special occasion in the near future to release on. And speaking of which, that actually reminds me. On June 12th of 2020, Baldi's Basics Plus was originally released for early access. And if we look at our calendars, in less than 10 days, the anniversary of that game is coming. So while I wouldn't quote me on anything that I'm about to say here, I wouldn't be surprised if Baldi's Basics Classic Remastered came sooner than we were all expecting. And by soon, I think maybe even in a couple of weeks. But you know what? I guess we'll just have to see. And by see, I mean just check the comments below on June 12th, and we'll either see comments saying that this video aged like fine wine, or some saying that this video aged like watered down milk. But hey, milk's pretty good too. And you know what else is good? Subscribing.